The first function I set out to implement was the ECB encryption process given in Chapter 6.1 of the specification. I optimistically assumed that the input plaintext is a multiple of the block size of AES, which is 128 bits, which itself is 16 bytes. With this, it's clear that the resulting code is written for educational demo purposes and not a professional implementation to be used in a real setting. As the specification indicates, the ECB mode simply encrypts each plaintext block of 128 bits into a ciphertext block, with all the resulting ciphertext blocks forming the overall cipher for the input plaintext. The AES block cipher encryption I imported from the AES implementation module I wrote before. Once done with implementing the ECB encryption process, the first test case for the ECB encryption passed. The ECB decryption process was very similar to the ECB encryption process, and I again imported the underlying AES block cipher decryption from the AES implementation module I wrote before. Once this was done, also the test case for the ECB decryption process passed. Next one up was to implement the CBC encryption as given by Chapter 6.1 of the specification, which requires special handling of the first plaintext block that is XORed against the IV before encryption to provide the first ciphertext block. Following this, each subsequent plaintext block then has to be XORed with the previous ciphertext block, with the result to then being encrypted with AES and to then form the new ciphertext block. Once this was implemented, the first AES-CBC test case passed. Last function left to implement was the CBC decryption, which I again started with a special handling of the first ciphertext block that required, after AES decryption, to be XORed against the IV. All later ciphertext blocks then just had to be decrypted, with the result XORed against the previous ciphertext block to provide the plaintext block. All plaintext blocks collected together then formed the overall plaintext. Having finished with this, finally all the NIST test vector-based test cases passed.